Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Vivian Schiller. I am the Vice President and Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We're a program of the Aspen Institute that focuses on the issues of the intersection of tech and media, but I'm a long history working in news organizations. And I should disclose up top that I'm actually on the board of directors of Shomrim, who's represented here, so I feel like I should say that from the get-go. So the topic that we're going to be addressing today is about the twin pairing of censorship and self-censorship. Censorship, I think anybody that's been in journalism is very familiar with. Self-censorship, I think in many ways, is a unique situation, particularly when you are a journalist covering a nation at war, and you yourself are a citizen. And in fact, the three panelists we have today face that triple threat: censorship, self-censorship, and that sort of tension between the identity of being a citizen and being a journalist. And I think in some ways the last one can be the hardest. And nowhere is that more acute than in the two countries that are represented here, which is Israel and Ukraine. Israel, of course, where a nation is divided about, well, united on many ways and divided on the topic of how the war in Gaza is being prosecuted, and in Ukraine, which unbelievably is now going into year 4 of the war. Before we get started, and when we first were talking about this panel a few months ago, I didn't imagine I'd be saying this, but here I am. As an American, I never imagined these issues would resonate so much for me as a citizen of the United States. I will admit that I think that was clearly a naive failure of imagination on my part, to think that we would be immune in the United States forever from such things. But I'm beginning to see a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking today manifesting in my own country. So I felt like I wanted to say that out loud. And we can talk about it later, but I think there's plenty to talk about when it comes to Israel and Ukraine. So let me introduce our panelists. All the way at the end, and hopefully we will be able to hear each other, sometimes that's a little tricky, is Omer Ben Jacob. He is an investigative journalism for Haaretz, where he focuses on the intersection of national security, geopolitics, technology, also covers disinformation, cybersecurity, and surveillance, all the good stuff. Next is Milan Cherny. He's an investigative journalist for Shomrim. If you're not familiar with Shomrim, it's Israel's independent, it's fairly new, it's only been, 3 or 4 years now? Independent nonprofit investigative news organization in Israel. He covers OSINT-based reporting on the war in Gaza and in Ukraine, and has appeared in outlets all over the world, including the AP and Forward and Haaretz. And then immediately to my right is Olga Rudenko. She is the editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Independent, which is an award-winning media startup that launched in November of 2021 by the former editorial team of the Kyiv Post, and she's written for many global publications as well. So we have a really quite amazing set of panelists here today. So let's get into it. We're going to start by talking specifically about censorship, because as tough as it is, it's sort of the easiest thing to get your head around in many ways. So, Milan, I'm gonna start with you. Because I want to start with you because not only are you dealing with censorship, but you've written quite a bit about censorship. So tell us what the state of play is in Israel right now when it comes to censorship by the state or others.
Right. I mean, so the first thing I think which is important to note is that there's a military censor in place in Israel. I mean, it's not something new, it's something that has been basically ongoing since the creation of the state. But obviously, at times of war, the military censor is more powerful because everything has to do with national security. And what it means on a daily basis as a journalist is that there's many things that Israeli journalists know and cannot report about. And foreign journalists do not have to abide by this military censor and can write about some of these topics. So Sometimes there's some article which I cannot write about because I know they will be taken down by the military censor, and then I see these same ideas and kind of scoop being published in international press, right? So this is kind of one way in which censorship is active in Israel. The second way is through gag orders, which have been imposed at a very increasing rate after October 7 regarding cyber attack and cyber leaks. So this is a topic that I've covered a lot, and Omer as well, where basically there's been a lot of cyber attack against Israeli government ministry. And even if Israel has this image of like cyber powerhouse, a lot of these cyber attacks have been successful, and the data has been leaked online. And gag orders were imposed by different ministries.
I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying the information that was leaked via a cyber attack, that's what they're putting the gag order on.
Yeah.
Right, but we cannot even report on the fact that the cyber attack took place in the first place.
Okay.
As well as report on document itself, right? And so it's also a way, obviously, for the ministry to escape responsibility, right? Because nobody can write about it, and nobody can say, well, there has been a cyber attack, and in some cases, it's not only that the hackers are powerful, it's that the ministry didn't protect the information of its citizen carefully enough.
Yeah. So but you in fact have reported on the fact that this gag orders exists to the public to say you don't know that these things are happening because we can't write about them.
Right, and so I actually went to court against the Ministry of National Security headed by Itamar Ben-Gvir 2 weeks ago, because there was a cyber attack, there was some data that was leaked, and to kind of try to lift this gag order, it took a lot of time, of resources to go to court and try to lift the veil on some of this information. Obviously, I cannot, even if I went to court and I've went through this process, I cannot even talk freely about the extent of it and what is the nature of the information. So I can say that a cyber attack has taken place and the ministry has a responsibility in the nature of the information that was leaked, which was very sensitive regarding Israeli citizens, but I cannot talk freely about it, and I think it's something that's very important. But as journalists, it took us several months and a lot of resources. We went to court twice. It's also a lot of pressure as a journalist, a lot of time to try to lift this gag order. And this was on one leak, right? And there's so many leaks, and each time if you want to report about it, it takes every time a legal battle, which is pretty challenging.
Yeah, Milan, we're going to stick with Israel for a minute, and then we'll come to you, Olga. So talk more about, you said that, it's been, obviously, I mean, there was some censorship before October 7th, but particularly since then, and there's certain things that, you cannot write about. I'm curious, so I want to hear about your experiences. I also want to unpack a little bit something Milan said, which is the nature of the fact that some things you cannot report about in Israel, but reporters outside Israel can write about it, and of course it's freely available on the internet. So I want to hear more about that.
I think, so we have this joke in Israel that the first rule of the censor is you can't talk about the censor. It's like Fight Club. And this creates this very funny dynamic in which you can write about certain manifestations of things, but you can't connect it always to the full story. So even now, the Israeli censorship laws apply to every Israeli wherever they are. So even in this room right now, there are things that I cannot legally say. So I'm going to not directly respond to Milan, but talk about other leaks that may have happened and say that, so there was another leak from another ministry, and it's part of this very big wave of Iranian hacking leaks, and very, very big leak, extremely lucrative for journalists in many fields. And we started reporting this, and then the relationship with the censorship is actually very Israeli and funny. It's like a WhatsApp account called The Censor, and you just send them the file, and then they send back like this, or they call you up and say, listen, in paragraph 4 it says this leak happened in Israel. Can you say, according to foreign reports? And then you go, comma, according to foreign reports. And at some point we sent the story to the censorship, and they just called us and said, listen, the story you want to report on, there's 2 gag orders and 1 censorship order on the story. So which one do you want us to bar you from publication from? The story is gagged from a million kind of things. And The one good thing I'll say about this is that I think it does, like, there's, at least before October 7th, and I'll say something very unpopular now, I actually enjoyed working with a censor, because I think I think journalists don't want people to die without need because of their work. So if I get a leak that has all the list of all the Mossad agents in Europe, right? That's a sexy story, but I wouldn't necessarily publish their names and addresses, right? And if the censor says, listen, these people are going to die, then it's okay for me to write, leak exposes Israeli agents abroad without giving the details. Post-October 7th, I think the censorship is, at least from my experience, has lost this kind of professional, in many senses, core. They were never perfect, yeah? It's an undemocratic system and it's extremely problematic. But for me, I always felt that it does protect me from causing harm at some level. And post-October 7th, I don't know this is true. I don't feel it's true. And a lot of times, like me and Milan in our work kind of dialogues in this way, that you almost have to like launder bits and pieces of information, right? So I can write one thing. I was, in theory, maybe also reporting about this. I don't know, it might be other leaks. And after I published, Milan can go to court and say, hey, I read on Haaretz that this came out. And it's almost this like little, like we launder little facts to get them into the public domain. And then once it's in the public domain, I can say, you know, there's this place in
According
the south.
to,
Yeah, there's a place in the south called Dimona.
You know, I mean, what you were talking about before, your experiences before October 7th, in terms of wanting to make sure that you don't publish any information that might harm. I mean, that's any, you know, professional journalist all over the world will, you know, in seeking comment from the government. I mean, in the United States, you seek comment. If they go, hey, we don't want you to report on this for X, Y, and Z, you know, a responsible news organization will say, okay, we're going to withhold this because it could, but it's not the government. It's more a professional responsibility. It's not. There's no prior restraint, at least, we'll see, at least as of today. What date is it? Watch this space in the United States. Yeah, October 12th, there's no prior restraint in the United States, but responsible journalists will do the right thing. Nobody wants to put people in harm's way. So, but here you actually do, here it actually is a prior restraint.
It is, and I think there's, again, like there's a lot of Israeli reporters here, like it's almost become an art, like how you go around it. So there's a specific country in Asia whose name I can't mention that Israel works with a lot, and I'm very interested in this country. Maybe you could say almost city, more than a country, city-state. And like for months, I was just telling Milan, like I would bury paragraphs about them in other stories to get the paragraphs out in the public domain. And I laid the groundwork for a future investigation where I have these paragraphs come out. And that for me is because I don't accept the censorship logic about this country. This country is sensitive to about itself for geopolitical reasons. And that to me is not a valid line of argumentation. So I don't fully abide by the censorship in that context.
One more question about Ukraine, and about Israel, and then I want to come to you, Olga. Foreign reporters who are operating in Israel, how do they face the same conditions? Is this language-based, or is this country of origin-based?
I mean, I think like a lot of things in Israel, it's kind of unclear, to be honest. In theory, they should abide by the censor, but in practice, if a journalist in New York publishes about something going on in Israel, there's no way the censor can force him to take the article down, right? So,
can they take away the accreditation of the media organization in Israel? Can they kick out New York Times out of Israel, for example?
yeah.
In theory, yes, there's people in this room that can talk to this better than us, but the thing is that you have to disclose to the censorship yourself, and in theory, the choice if to abide by them is yours. Like you can decide to break censorship, and for certain stories in Haaretz, we don't send to the censor because we don't think we need it, and it'll call us up and say, you know, you should have sent this to us. But in theory, the censorship laws applies to every Israeli wherever they are. So if you're, say, an Israeli who writes for the New York Times, then in theory, this censorship is supposed to apply to you. For some reason, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Specifically.
Okay. Let's turn to Ukraine, Olga, and talk a little bit about, I know things have evolved over the last 3 years in terms of government censorship and the ramifications of martial law. So what restrictions are you on in terms of reporting about your own country?
It's interesting. Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me. It's interesting that you started with evolved, because actually the initial rules that was set up in the very beginning of the invasion back in March 2022, the formal rules have not changed much. or maybe have not changed at all, but there are formal rules and there are rules that are implicated, and then there is very informal pressure. So it was very interesting for me to hear what you've been talking about, because did I get it right when you were talking about military censor that can take down a story, that there's like a formal body that reviews things like this? So this doesn't exist in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there are rules that were put out by the, I think it was the general staff in the beginning of the invasion, but there is no one body that...
WhatsApp account, a censor.
There's no one body that can reach out to you and say, hey, this violates this, and you need to take it down. Instead, there are all various, actors, military units, security service, government agencies that put pressure on journalists, usually informally, usually in the form of informal requests, phone calls, and so on, asking to take something down or not report something based on this harming the security of Ukraine. And sometimes it has like a vague relation to the formal rules. Sometimes it's just something very, very, very vague and informal, like they say, like, this is going to be bad for Ukraine's national security, and they don't explain how. And as a journalist, naturally, your instinct is not to trust people in the government. And when they say, you need to take this down, or you need to not report this, because this is going to harm Ukraine, the instinctive thought is somebody is trying to cover up their asses by pretending this is about national security. But maybe it's not, so you don't know. You never know, and you have to take a somewhat calculated risk every time you respond to a request like this. And they can be from something big to something pretty small and ridiculous. I just remembered last week or so, one small regional media outlet asked me for advice on how to deal with a request that they had from one military unit to take down a certain video, or part of a certain video that they published. The video was from a training ground where they train fresh recruits, I think. And the video included some fragment of one of the recruits being trained is feeling unwell in the video, and he's feeling dizzy, or he falls down, something like this, like he's exhausted by exercise, which happens, but they wanted it down. They wanted it down because they
didn't want to show that a weakness on the part of...
They, I think they said something like it's gonna hurt our efforts to like mobilize people or something. But that's a ridiculous explanation, because there are so many other things hurting mobilization effort in Ukraine, including corruption, including just the fact that people are afraid and they know they can be killed. So that minor thing definitely didn't have the value that they were attaching to it. So in that case, that was probably an overreach of a specific, spokesperson, press secretary, somebody, like some representative of the unit. But the thing is, they represented a pretty powerful organization within Ukraine. So, and this is a small newsroom that they are asking to do something that is so ridiculous, but they represent somebody that in Ukraine you don't want to make enemies with this organization, with this government agency, and with military unit that they represent. And so I don't know if they went for it. I don't know if they took down the fragment, but it's just an example of and it can be bigger things. It can be things like you run a story that implies like a frontline report that implies that there are difficulties with supplies in a certain part of the frontline, which is pretty public, everybody's talking about it. But then, somebody reaches out to tell you that you did something horrible for Ukraine's national security, it's going to hurt somebody, and so on. It's never you violated this. It's never formal. So in some way, I almost have respect for how it's set up in your country, because there is at least some, the way you describe it, there is at least some transparency in how it's done. Nothing of that sort exists in Ukraine. And there's also the fact that the media outlets that are loyal to the government, or the anonymous Telegram channels that maybe connected to the government, they can get away with publishing much more than an independent outlet. So you would, normally, for example, we can't publish photos or videos of the consequences of missile strikes in Ukrainian cities immediately after the strike. There's some time needs to pass if it's a civilian location, and if it's a military one, photos may never be published. And then you see like Telegram channels publishing them right away. If we do that, we can get in trouble. If they do that, they are anonymous. They enjoy their absence of accountability. In some cases, it's a pretty well-known fact that those channels are connected to the government, but there is no way to effectively prove it. So they basically are allowed to bend the rules in the ways that we can't. And apart from that, so there is this, there are formal rules, there are implicated rules, and I think they are vague on purpose, almost, because that creates the very helpful confusion, and you can, if you represent a powerful enough agency inside Ukraine, government agency, you can try to put pressure on journalists, citing unexisting rules or interpreting them in the way that is beneficial to you. So the confusion really benefits the government and the bad actors who want to use the pretext of the war to just cover up their actions and so on. And then there is another issue that is the illegal and informal pressure on journalists. And that's something that happens a few times in the past 3 years. We had cases of illegal surveillance of journalists, including by installing hidden cameras in hotel rooms, which is unheard of in Ukraine. And those cases, the most scandalous ones, they have taken place like 1 year ago. So they have not been a scandalous thing, like a really bad thing like that in the past year. At the same time, the people who were behind that are still in their places in certain government services. So we live in anticipation that it can happen again.
Thank you. Well, we want to move now from censorship, whether it's slightly more formal in Israel or less so in Ukraine, to the topic of self-censorship, by which I mean, just to define the term, by which I mean the pressure that may come from the public or from the readers, depending on what you report, and the sense that perhaps you are being disloyal to your country or harming your country in the reporting. So let's come back to Israel. So Milan, you said that things have changed a bit, right? I mean, there was the immediate post-October 7th conditions, and now that how things are a year and a half on. So how do you experience that in Israel with your reporting, and any kind of pressure from readers about a certain way that you should behave or a certain way you should talk about what Israel how Israel is responding?
So there's, I think, there's been very little self-censorship from Israeli journalists to report about corruption within the Israeli government, Israeli minister, and potential wrongdoing, even just after October 7. And I think this is something which might be interesting to compare to Ukraine, because I think it has evolved a lot in Ukraine on how to report about internal corruption at a time of war within your own government. And I mean, I know in Ukraine some papers have continued to do it, but I think it took perhaps a bit of time after February 2022 to start doing this kind of reporting again in Ukraine from investigative journalists. But in Israel after October 7th, so I've done a lot of articles based on soldiers' social media videos that have been uploaded on TikTok from Gaza and from other places. And I think this is a topic that I couldn't have covered just after October 7. I mean, on October 7, there were already videos being uploaded from soldiers engaging in, let's say, unruly behavior. And if I would have written about this topic on October 8, there would not have been an audience for this kind of reporting, just because of the shock of October 7. And it took some time for myself, but I think also for society, to be able to hear this kind of reporting and for me as a journalist to be able to report on it as well, and report it and reflect on it, and make a piece out of it. So I think it also take a time, and it evolved with time, I think both in Ukraine and in Israel, on what are the limits that we impose on ourselves, on the topic that we are going to cover, and so on.
Go ahead, Omar.
I think this issue of self-censorship is really important and really touches kind of questions, or at least for me, about what is the motivation for your work. Like if you're writing, it's not so much about, you know, appeasing your local audience as much as fulfilling your societal role. And I'll just take the example of these Hacken leaks kind of that we wrote about, or even the soldiers that Milan is writing about. Like from my perspective, the people who break the censorship in Israel the most is the army, because they love doing this like boys in their toys porn, and they like put you know, the soldiers, and they show everything, and like 9 times out of 10 they're actually breaking the censorship laws. And then you come to write about this stuff, and then they tell you can't, and you're like, no, but you know,
social media.
no, not even forget the soldiers. Like the Ministry of Defense itself is the biggest person, like the IDF spokesperson unit is the person who breaks the censorship the most, in a way, because they just want to do all this like, you know, war porn kind of stuff. And then, so on the one hand, you're like, okay, so it's fine to do it if it's for this, you know, kind of bravado kind of stuff. But when you look about like the Hacken leaks, and this is what touches to the motivation, is that like, you know, there's pressure on you. They tell you like, listen, if you're going to write about this leak, you're telling everyone to go find this data. If there's like, for example, there's an application called Strava, you know, the running app. So I did an investigation about that. It exposes the location of soldiers. And they told us, listen, you can't publish this because you're going to reveal the location of the soldiers. And at some level, they're right, you know, like I don't want to expose. On the other hand, they're full of shit.
They're already exposed.
Yeah, they're already exposed. And then again, this is the motivation. My job as a reporter in my country is to flag issues. If these soldiers are doing something stupid, and this is dangerous, the censorship just told me it's dangerous, right? Then somebody better do something. And then after 2 months, if I still see the data, then the government loses, from my perspective, the ability to tell me that I can't report about this because there's now a public interest. The public interest is that soldiers are leaking data from Gaza. It is exposing their location. Israel told me it's dangerous, and the army is not doing anything to deal with it. The same with the Hacken leaks. Like, at some level, yeah, you don't want to give away people's personal information, but after a while you realize, and I think this is what me and Milan realized, this is actually an important story. Israeli society is there's very low cyber standards. Our data is leaking, and the government is censoring this fact. Like, I have a responsibility as a cyber reporter to say, the gun licenses are exposed, the Justice Ministry is exposed, all these bodies are exposed, and as a citizen, I want someone to deal with this. And you can't just tell me, no, you're flagging the issue, you're exposing the data.
Have either of you had any blowback from public on anything that you've reported? I'm not talking about the censors.
Have you had a week in which you've been not accused of being at fault for October 7th?
Yeah, one of the issues, just so you know, in this room is we can't hear each other very well. It's very strange, so I didn't actually hear what you
I joke that we get blamed all the time for October 7th, so.
That part of the stage is the most difficult one to hear. So I'm just like, just off the emotions and the response of the room, I know that you're saying something so interesting, and I can't hear like 60% of that. I should watch the video of the panel after this.
Yeah. I want to just cover one other issue that we talked about a little bit before this panel, which is the difference between how when it comes to issues that sort of get people riled up or that might have blowback at you as reporters, the difference between Israelis in Israel and people outside of Israel. I'm curious to hear more about that. How do you see that difference? I think, Omer, you talked about this.
I can say something very small. I write a lot about disinformation, and at some point during the war, I got a huge leak of all the campaigns the government was doing, and I looked into it, and the reality of it was that they were just terrible. Like, it was complete shit. Like, this Israeli government spent like I don't know, like 30 million shekels on the most stupid campaigns ever, and like on the one hand, you like, if I were to publish this in English, it would be like, Israel spends millions on international influence campaign. But the reality is that they were like, it was the crappiest influence I'd ever seen. And then this tension is like, what do you write about? The failure of them to do the influence? Or like, you know what I mean? And I think there's these very interesting challenges. And when we write about the influence stuff, that is the stuff we get the most blowback for. Because then the answer is, why are you doing this? Like, why are you saying that we do this? Like, if you don't think it's actually a problem. And I think the answer is we do think it's a problem, even if it sucks, you know.
You do get a different reaction from outside of Israel.
Very much, right.
A stronger reaction, yeah?
I mean, so I've been doing this article on Soldiers Video, and I think this is something where foreign audience and Israeli audience see it very, very differently, because when I write about it, foreign audience write to me and say, well, what do we care that they publish TikTok in Gaza if they commit potential war crime? And in Israel, it's a different perspective, because it's like this lack of discipline and the fact that they're using their phone and engaging in unruly behavior says a lot about internal dynamic in Israeli society and about the army and about who we are. And so when I write for Israeli audience, I will address it in a different way, saying, well, the army shouldn't engage in these practices. Because it's not only about TikTok, it's about if you start with TikTok, then it goes further than that, right? If you film video in Gaza and post it on TikTok and violate potential censorship and so on, well, then potentially you can take another step and fire randomly in Gaza as well, right? And so I think this is an issue where I see a big difference in how it's received in international audience and in domestic.
The international audiences receive it differently. It's less about the discipline and more about the actual acts.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's come to, let me come to you, Olga. I think, you know, we could spend the rest of the time talking about the difference between the situation in Israel and Ukraine, but of course, one of the biggest differences is that Ukraine is certainly more divided on the outcome of how the war is being prosecuted, I would imagine. So how do you experience, is it an issue for you? Do you get blowback from the public, from your readers, when you, say, talk about corruption, or you report on things about the Ukrainian government in terms of the war effort? And also, if you can just pull a little bit back, I can hear you a little bit better.
Okay, I'll try. Well, I wouldn't say that the country is divided per se. I would say that there are many micro divisions. Like, a war is a polarizing experience in the sense that people have, I mean, it's uniting in the sense of, you know, when this ends, all those millions of people of us, we all have lived through the war, but we have lived through it in different ways. Some have fought at the front line, some have not, some have lost somebody, some have not, and so on and so on. So the experience is pretty different. There are divisions there. I know that, so we mostly don't write for the Ukrainian audience. We do some things that are translated into Ukrainian, but mostly we do reporting for international audience following Ukraine. But I know from experience of my colleagues in Ukraine that, for example, it was discussed at a side event that was specifically about journalism in Ukraine that was taking place yesterday, that one of the most divisive topics is the coverage of the work of recruitment centers, of the centers that recruit people for the army, because there is a part of society that is that have volunteered to fight, and those who support them, and so on, those who have somebody in their family who has volunteered to fight and is fighting or was killed or was injured, and there is of course a portion of people who don't want to go to fight, which is expected. And there are some who illegally evade draft. So when those issues, and at the same time there's corruption at the recruitment centers, and sometimes it's been well known and well reported that you can, for a certain amount of money, you can buy your way out of draft. And there have been people punished for that. Well, not punished yet, but at least arrested, detained, but I don't know if there were actual court sentences for that. But anyways, like, this topic is divisive because those are very, very polar sets of people. But for us specifically, what's been divisive is, and what's earned us some pushback was, I think, first and foremost, anything that is critical of President Zelensky. Because in Ukraine, when you're writing for Ukrainian audience, you can get away with government criticism pretty well. Like, Ukrainians have a pretty healthy habit of questioning the government and having the distrust in the government. And, but for the foreign audience watching Ukraine, for the audience supporting Ukraine, up until very recently, I think President Zelensky was the figure not to be questioned, so to say, the hero. And
for purposes of unity.
For the purposes of unity, for the purposes of keeping, like, you know, rallying the international support of Ukraine and so on and so on. But he's a human being and he's a politician, and that comes with with a certain set of things, and he needs to be under public scrutiny and under media scrutiny because he's the president of a country. He needs to be held accountable, including through media, even during the war. And anything that is even remotely going in that direction sometimes wins us some pushback from the readers. I think one of the biggest times, the most problematic stories for us was when we, a little over a year ago, we wrote about the divisions between President Zelensky and then Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, who was fired, or resigned a couple months after that. But there were divisions that were very well known and reported in Ukraine at the time. But we were one of the first ones to report it for the international audience, that there is a division between the president and the commander-in-chief, and it's for political reasons, and it's for reasons that apparently they don't get along so well, or something. That, that was the only time, I think, when some people unsubscribed from the Kyiv Independent saying this is because of this story. But I still stand by the fact that the story needed to be told. And but that was a time for me when I looked at it, I thought, and we are really funded. The subscribers are what's making the Kyiv Independent possible. And I looked at that and thought, okay, there can be a future where we have to make a choice between journalistic integrity and what we believe is in public interest, and being a financially successful growing organization. So and for me the choice is painful but obvious. But that was the moment when I realized it's coming. And on the topic of self-censorship, I think my take on it is a bit unusual because I think it's a bit more positive than one can expect. I think that Ukrainian journalists have largely passed the test of self-censorship, because it was pretty bad in 2022, and not for the first 6 months or so. There were basically no reports about government corruption, something like that. But I just saw in conversations, in private conversations with different journalists, and it was especially concerning to see it in young journalists, that they are leaning towards listening to the government when they privately ask them not to publish something for security reasons. So the things I described in the first part of the conversation, I heard journalists, both experienced and very young, saying, yes, it's war, we shouldn't write about corruption, and if the government says, don't report about that because there is some national security interest, we should listen because there is war. And I thought, this is not how it's supposed to be happening. Your instincts should be telling you something different. But I think that kind of this self-censorship has become more marginal now. It's not mainstream for
You understand the instinct. You're a citizen. It's your country. Your country has been invaded. So I mean, it's
but I think it would help, and I think this is a lesson that everyone else can take out of the experience of Ukrainian journalists with self-censorship. To keep in mind, even when you're at the epicenter of something horrible is happening around you, there's an invasion of your country, which is, there's Russia, so everything can happen. The dust always settles. It can take time, but the dust always settles, and you may be sorry that you didn't publish something early enough.
Yeah. Would you cover the same topic in the same way if you were writing in Ukrainian? Because, I mean, the Kyiv Independent is probably one of the kind of biggest window into Ukrainian English language, and so I'm wondering, if you were writing in Ukrainian, and I mean, there's other Ukrainian outlets. So I was,
In terms of like self-censorship, there wouldn't be a difference. There are no topics that we shy away from, and there wouldn't be if we were in Ukrainian. In terms of we would be adding more context maybe for Ukrainians and using. The stories would be slightly different, but in terms of self-censorship, there would be no difference. There would be none.
I think you don't want to jump in, okay. We're going to turn to, we're going to turn to questions now, and then I have if we have time, I have a final question for our panelists. Is there anybody, other mics running around? Okay, over here, just, and if you could please introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then keep your question as brief as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Abir. I'm a freelance journalist, and actually I am a Hebrew speaker. So I followed the Israeli media really closely during the last year and a half. And I have to say, I find it insane that Israeli journalists were more worried with the fact that the soldiers were releasing videos from Gaza more than what the soldiers were doing in Gaza. And I find this really insane. So I want also, when we address the issue of censorship, we talk about what censorship, and if really in the case of Israeli media, if the censorship was only placed on issues of military or criticizing the government, but actually the Israeli media, and there are so many archives, has taken a role of state propaganda, and not even self-censorship, it's beyond self-censorship. It's inciting to genocide. There are plenty of journalists with not one video, two videos, three videos, who were inciting constantly. It's mainstream media, not even right-wing media.
Thank you.
So I wonder, when we talk about self-censorship, when are we and we are all journalists here, going to talk about journalists who are not implying self-censorship, rather taking a step forward and helping in and being complicit in genocide?
Okay, I will say, I'm going to turn it to Omar. I will say, what you were describing is not what I heard our two journalists say, but go ahead, Omar, I'll let you respond.
That's kind of what I wanted to say. I don't want to talk for Israeli media, and I also don't think that's actually like something that is really relevant. I want to talk about my motivation as an Israeli, and it's okay that you find it insane. I don't need you to find me sane. I'm reporting for my country, and my country might be terrible for you, but it's still my home. And I have a kid now, and I want my country not to deteriorate into a fascist apartheid state. And this is my motivation, okay? Because it's my home. Not because I need you or anyone here to tell me that I'm okay and I'm complicit or not complicit. I'm complicit, okay? I pay taxes. I'm complicit. I'll solve the problem for you. I'm completely complicit. So in that sense, I don't take responsibility for Israeli media. I take responsibility for myself. And you can be angry at it. It's okay. I'm used to people being angry at me. Haaretz is stuck. We're stuck. Let me finish, please.
Okay.
Haaretz is stuck between the international world, being that we're too Zionist, and Israeli media telling us we're too left-wing. It's okay. After October 7th, I have clarity. I write for my son, Rafael. I write so my country does not deteriorate. And does that mean there's no other room for any other journalist? Of course not. It's important that there's external criticism, completely. But it's not my job to play every position in the world, and it's certainly not my job to do this performance in which I'm complicit in as much as my taxes and my country is involved in this. And you can nod your head, it's okay. I'm okay with it. I'm not looking for your confirmation. I'm looking to save my country. And my country might be terrible for you, but it does not matter to me. In that sense, I don't care what anyone in this room thinks about me. Genuinely. I'm writing for my country. And my country is in a terrible state. And I want to stay there because it's my home. And I want to make sure it doesn't deteriorate. And it's been in a liberal democracy for 67 years, yeah? And I want to stop it from doing bad things, but my motivation is internal. I'm trying to save my democracy from deteriorating. So does that also mean that there's an external perspective that is important? 100%, but it does not negate my identity. And though I don't identify as Zionist, the reality is that I'm Zionist because I live in Israel and my money goes to the government. And I accept the moral turpitude that comes with it. It's my choice, and I live with it.
Thank you, Omar. Another question. We have I can't really see very well, so I see somebody with their hand over here. Just over here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Leila from the European Legal Support Center. You just talk about democracy and that your country was living in democracy, like liberal democracy you just mentioned. And when you talk about censorship and self-censorship, There is something that, in my opinion, is missing because, okay, you're talking about like daily basis censorship after the October 7 and briefly before October 7, but there is maybe the elephant in the room in the way of how Israel narrated their public history and their official history, which is, you just talked about home, what is home for you, but like what was at his home for you has been catastrophe for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were like expelled in 1948. And how can you talk about like censorship nowadays without taking into consideration the public history and the narrative that there is official in Israel without mentioning how the state and public history is built?
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to summarize that question is, you're reporting about the occupied territories, about Gaza, and how you address that before October 7th and after. Do you want to take this one?
I mean, I think there's no question that the censorship imposed against Palestinians and against Arab citizens of Israel and Palestinians who live in Israel is stronger. Right? I think there's no
100%.
debate about this. And I think, reporting about the Nakba and reporting about Palestine for Arab citizens of Israel and Palestine is harder, and I think there's no question about that. I don't think
100%.
Waving a Palestinian flag in Israel is basically impossible and very difficult. And showing movies about the occupation in Yafo and in other places comes with a cost. And there's no question that the censorship is stronger against this part of the population. And what we are saying, we are not saying that the censorship is only against us, right? We are talking about our experience to say that, well, it's also against kind of Jewish Israeli paper. As I'm non-Arab, I feel it's not really my place, and I don't know exactly what is the experience of Palestinian journalists in Israel. And I'm more than willing to listen to it, and I think that what they are facing is harder than we are facing, and there's no question about this, definitely.
100%. I'll even just jump onto that and say, I think I have a moral responsibility to abuse my privilege as a Jewish Israeli to report within Israel against the government. And you asked me a question which I didn't understand because I almost wanted to be annoying and say, is Israel in the room with us? Like, did you hear me say something about an official narrative? Like, we know all this stuff, we know this. But, I'm also a journalist in Israel and I want to use my power for good. So does that preclude the existence of other journalists? Of course not. But I was talking yesterday with the people from 972 and Local Call, which is another Israeli organization here. And for us, our motivation is clear. It's clear. We're using our privilege in an apartheid reality to speak truth to power. And the price of that is that you will forever judge me, but I'm okay with that, really.
If I can add to this, as I said, I went to court 2 weeks ago against the ministry of Itamar Ben-Gvir because I can do it, because I know
Exactly.
I won't face a backlash. I know for people who live, my neighbors and people who live next to me, it's not possible.
Yep.
We have time for one more question. Somebody that, I don't know where the mics are, so wherever the mic is close to somebody with their hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaroslava, and I'm affiliated with Oxford as a researcher there. And I actually have a question about this aspect of self-censorship, because Olha, you said that you have formal rules, informal rules, and then the question is that you're also working with a lot of people who are, for example, in Russian captivity or on the occupied territories, reporting on them as well. And sometimes saying or not saying something can mean more danger for them. And I feel like this is the part of reporting that is not covered kind of by any rules. And I was wondering how you navigate this kind of risks, including security risks for your interlocutors and for the journalists themselves. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The reporting from occupied territories is virtually impossible now in Ukraine because there's no access for Ukrainian journalists at all. at all. The only reporting that we can do, and that's what our War Crimes Investigations Unit has been doing, is either you report about the state of occupied territories and freedoms and like human rights violations there and torture there, using the testimony of people who have just left the occupied territories or have recently left, or you talk to people who have family there and they talk to the family through secure channels, or you do the riskiest thing, which is you talk to people in the occupied territories through security channels. But that's a big ethical dilemma, because any way you do it, you are putting those people in a big risk. So it's we mostly only do it for war crimes investigations, which is where the value is the biggest. We can uncover something like the existence of torture chambers, for example, in occupied territories, the current existence. So the stakes are very high there. But I'm happy that you mentioned it, because it's actually an opportunity to remind everybody that later today, I think there's going to be a panel in this very room about reporting from occupied territories, about a specific Ukrainian journalist who risked everything and went to the occupied territories in 2022 and was captured, tortured, and killed in prison. And there's going to be a panel dedicated to her here in this room later today. Her name was Victoria Roshina.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us about her. Well, on that difficult note, we're out of time, but I want to thank very much our panelists, Omer, Milan, and Olga, both for being here with us and for the work that you do. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.